My sincere thanks to Garden Court Chambers for providing us with the space and also the refreshments that will be available in the adjoining room after the event. A brief intro to RSI and its mission. We were established in 1990 to promote human rights in the counterterrorism context, primarily in Northern Ireland. We, after 9/11, expanded our work so that we had a UK-wide focus, including many issues of Islamophobia in UK national security efforts. And we are now internationalizing and continuing to promote human rights in the national security context worldwide. And so I'm very happy that you joined us today. This is a kind of pilot event for us. It's our first in-person event since COVID. And so thank you so much for being here. We've really got an all-star panel who will introduce themselves shortly. I will say briefly that PREVENT is the government's program to stop people from being drawn into terrorism. It has long been criticized for having a disproportionate impact on Muslims in Britain as well as people of color, I think as well as young men who are often caught up in this, and for having a chilling effect on free speech, freedom of religion, and many other human rights impacts. And today we're going to focus on the impact on privacy and data protection. I know that those rights often sound abstract, and in earlier parts of my career when I was working on government surveillance, I would think whenever I use the word privacy, I'm losing the argument. Because when you juxtapose privacy and national security, one of those always seems a lot weightier than the other. But the important thing to remember about privacy and data protection is that it's a question of the balance of power between the government and the governed. What does the government get to know about you? And what does it get to do with that information? And so it's also, you can think of privacy and data protection as gateway rights to free expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, many of those other things that many of us tend to think of as core rights. Because if information is being captured of you, captured about you, stored, shared, potentially forever, potentially with anyone, it can really have a discouraging effect on many freedoms that are fundamental in a democracy. So I'm going to hand this over to our panel moderator, Amanda Weston, who is a top barrister on human rights, public law, and national security, among many other areas of expertise. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. Amanda, you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. We do have a really amazing panel for you this evening, and we're going to start with Jacob Smith, who's going to come and tell you a little bit about him, what he does with RSI, and to introduce the latest report. Take it away, Jacob.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to all of you for coming today. Thanks to Garden Court Chambers as well for hosting the event for us. So today I'm going to just briefly outline the methodology of the report, some of the basic conclusions that we reached. I'm RSI's UK Accountability Officer, so I do a lot of work as well outside of the PREVENT context, trying to hold the UK government accountable for major national security related human rights concerns. In summary, the report sets out that PREVENT really sets the stage for law breaking when it comes to privacy and data issues. The report concludes that there is a violation of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to private and family life, whilst also suggesting it's likely that the way data is used under PREVENT breaches data protection legislation. By way of methodology, we rely on publicly available material. Although there's a dearth of this information, we are still able to come to those conclusions. We recognise there's kind of more information out there, but that's kind of the conclusion that we've reached anyway. We don't evaluate individual authorities' practices, and we do have some information about how some authorities approach PREVENT, but not others. But really, we reach the conclusion that because of the way that PREVENT operates and the way that government instructs authorities to operate under PREVENT, that it does set the stage for law breaking. By way of conclusions, we've seen numerous examples of how PREVENT-related data processing can interfere with our right to privacy. So I've fit these into two broader categories. So firstly is the processing of information related to a PREVENT referral, so the fact of a referral, the consequences of that referral process, and any follow-up steps that have been taken, but also the processing of personal data for the purposes of that PREVENT referral. So these are things traditionally like the person's name, their date of birth, but also their religious or political beliefs. For the purposes of the ECHR and the Article 8 rights, these interferences can in some instances be lawful, and so long as 3 requirements are met. In order to do so, the authority must be acting in compliance with domestic and international laws. They must be trying to achieve a legitimate aim in processing that personal information, and it must be able to prove that its actions are necessary to reaching that aim. We find 2 main points of illegality in the report. So the first is on the issue of legality, so being in compliance with international and domestic laws. Under the ECHR, this requires that an interference is authorised by domestic law, but it also requires certain factors or qualities of that law. That the law must be clear, specific and accessible, basically so that people know how their personal data is going to be treated and how their data is going to be respected. The report concludes really that there are no real clear, specific and accessible laws that regulate data processing under prevents. We find that government policies prioritise data processing notwithstanding the existence of human rights and data protection laws. In many instances, in fact, government policies advise practitioners to not let human rights and data protection laws stand in the way of the referral process. On top of that, we also find that secret policies exist within authorities, whilst some public authorities make their prevent-specific data processing policy public, others don't, and have refused to do so. We find that actually, even when public authorities make their prevent policies public and they publicise them, they often can confuse practitioners in the way that they should actually treat personal data, and sometimes, in fact, the different guidance actually stresses different things. And so while if a practitioner looks at one piece of guidance that's relevant to their work, it might kind of tend towards referring an individual and sharing personal data. Other professional guidance might say the exact opposite. On top of that, we also recognise that the fact that a lot of prevent-related data processing is done by kind of policy, government policy, and that, in our view, doesn't meet the requirement of being a law. Secondly, we also dispute that the prevent-related data processing is necessary. Under Article 8, it requires the government must prove that doing so is necessary in order to achieve a particular legitimate aim. Over the years that Prevent's been operating, as I'm sure many of you will know, the government's yet to provide that evidence. And so it's yet to provide evidence that Prevent is effective in reaching that objective that Sarah mentioned, of stop people being drawn into terrorism, let alone reach the requirement of it being necessary to reach that objective. So yeah, that's the summary of the report. We have those kind of 2 major sources of illegality. As I mentioned, we've used publicly available information, but we've still been able to reach the conclusions that we have based on that. So I'll hand back to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much for that very helpful description of the report and the methodology. We also have 3 other speakers who are going to introduce themselves now, and I'm wondering if I could start with you, Dr. Aitlhadj.
Thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Hil Aked. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at MedAct. MedAct is an organisation which supports health workers to campaign on the social, political and economic factors shaping health, and that's very broad, so it ranges from climate change to the arms trade to the hostile environment in healthcare and the securitisation of health, which is where our Prevent work sits. We've published a couple of reports on Prevent. The first one's called False Positives, and it's looked at 4 different areas: so-called Prevent as so-called safeguarding, confidentiality and use of data, the impacts on different racial and religious minorities, and mental health as well, the impacts on people with mental health conditions. And then a more recent report that came out last year was honing in on an aspect of that which we found interesting, which is a specific project called the Vulnerability Support Hub, so I think it may have changed its name since then. But this is a project run by counter-terrorism police, in which they embed mental health workers into counter-terrorism units, including SO 15, and there are lots of problematic data sharing practices going on there, which we'll talk a bit more about. Did you want me to address a specific question or just introduce
No,
myself?
not just introduce us on the moment and then we'll
Sorry.
move on to some questions. No, it's good to have enthusiastic participants. Miqdaad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so with the Versi, I'm a public affairs team at Muslim Council Britain. I'm a board member of RSI, and I also I founded the Centre for Media Monitoring, which looks at how Muslims are treated in the media as a whole. When it comes to Prevent specifically, I've been a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain, in particular related to Prevent, and written quite extensively on it, and contributed to a couple of reports from the MCV and others on this topic, and hopefully we'll be able to share some of my thoughts as we go along.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Aitlhadj, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Layla Aitlhadj. I'm the Director and Senior Caseworker at Prevent Watch, which is an organisation that supports people impacted by Prevent. We've supported over 600 individuals to date, and we also recently contributed to the People's Review of Prevent, where I was co-author with Professor John Homewood, and that report looked at Prevent and all the issues around Prevent as an alternative to the government's short-loss review of Prevent that has yet to be published.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask you, Dr. Aitlhadj, to kick off, if I may, with this question, which is, why is it that data protection is so important? How does the storing and sharing of data affect other fundamental rights?
I think, firstly, when we're thinking about that question, we have to appreciate the fact that more than half of Prevent referrals are of children, and that sets the entire framework. So you can have 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds reported to Prevent. As soon as they're reported to Prevent, it will go to counter-terrorism officers who will vet that Prevent referral. So immediately you'll have their data associated with the criminal justice system because it will be stored on criminal databases. We've seen at least one case that went to the courts which revealed that there were 10 different police databases alone, forget social work and other agencies that were involved, but 10 police databases alone where an 11-year-old's data was being stored. This is a Prevent referral that wasn't referred to Channel, so even by Prevent's own logic, it wasn't a Prevent referral that required intervention, and yet that data was being stored across these databases. We've seen again in practice that this can have implications for further education. We have at least 2 cases where we've seen evidence of these children then going to further education colleges and that impacting their college. One was refused his, basically had his offer withdrawn from a college after he was accepted when they found out that he had been referred to Prevent as a youngster. Another one got into college, and this is an active case, and despite being accepted to college a few weeks later, an incident happened where he was speaking quite freely, had nothing to do with Prevent, and then they pulled up the fact that, oh yeah, you're talking about this, it's a bit controversial, clearly it's something he can speak about in terms of free speech, brought that up, but then also referred to his Prevent referral as a child. Now that child is not at school. There's no explanation, there's no written explanation by the school or anything as to why he's not at school. This is a live case right now, so you can see how easily this can impact people. We've had social workers who are involved with every child referral of Prevent get involved, so they will assess or try to assess the family, and they're coming in with this frame of mind that they are going to assess a family that are potentially radicalising a child. So it completely offsets that balance of how social workers interact with a family and how they should be offering support, because now they're coming in and they're looking at children with this lens of, you know, you're a potential terrorist or your parents are extremists. That will also mean then that child's data will be stored on the social workers database, even though they were never previously known to social work or children's services. And of course that can have, even though nothing happens, no further action happens, that then has implications going forward. As adults, we've seen from the policies, for example, of various local authorities, children's services, that their data is stored for up to 25 years after the age of 18. So this will impact them, their children. All you need is a malicious comment from a neighbour, to then open up another case, and then people are joining dots that don't actually exist to build up a profile. So it's extremely dangerous, and you can see how it can easily impact other
Yes, thank you. Would somebody like to describe or just set out, explain the difference between prevent and channel and how they fit together, just so that everybody's clear about that? Who'd like to do that?
So the channel process is the way of it's a multi-agency approach whereby a range of interested individuals, so potentially kind of social workers involved in there as well, then kind of get together and essentially decide to do what to do about a specific case. They may decide, the individual needs kind of extra intervention from kind of a range of potential actors, or they might decide this person doesn't need intervention. And as I think Dr. Aitlhadj just explained, sometimes we don't even know, or a person doesn't even know that they've been through the channel process or their case has been referred to channel. In the report, I touch on some of the channel specific guidance, and although it's kind of framed as a voluntary process, we find that actually in practice professionals are kind of told you can obtain consent after the channel process, and you don't have to obtain consent from an individual if you think that would frustrate the channel process. So yeah, that's just a bit of background on what channel is.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. Very well done. If you can start to cough, because I made an executive decision. That's really helpful. So I'm just wondering if I can just go back to you, if I may. What are the sorts of triggers that you see for a prevent referral, so that people can be clear about how very remote they are?
So these are comments, for example, real examples these are, of a 4-year-old child who said that he was playing with guns and bombs in his dad's shed, and he was referring to the online game Fortnite. The early years worker knew that this child had older cousins who played online games, but a prevent referral was made. That was referred to prevent. You have other comments where children will use the term jihadi. So there was one child, for example, who put it as his username for an activity they were doing in class and said, jihadi. That was referred to prevent. So these can be really kind of frivolous comments that are made by children, that don't need to actually go through a securitized process at all, and can be dealt with as teachable moments at school if necessary, but instead are referred to prevent.
Right, well that obviously sort of flags up the chilling effect, particularly in the education sector, but I'm wondering whether one of you would like to deal with, Dr. Aked perhaps, what are some of the other potential implications of prevent data sharing for things like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, that sort of thing?
Well, I think I can speak most usefully probably to the chilling effect in healthcare, because MedAct is a health organisation. And in short, we think that it is exacerbating racialised health inequalities. Obviously, everyone will know this, but it predominantly affects Muslim communities, Asian communities, and so when we're talking about like breaches of confidentiality, data sharing, those people disproportionately affected. And it's eroding trust far beyond actually being referred to prevent, in those communities. So it's also like a kind of thing that we need to think intersectionally about. So age matters, mental health conditions matter, gender matters, class matters. But I think that would be the long and short of it is, we had cases in our report, false positives, of a young man who was severely disabled and couldn't self-feed, nonetheless was reported to prevent by a physiotherapist. And what that does as well is to kind of comment to some of what Layla was talking about, how it damages education. It damages healthcare as well. So continuity of care is interrupted. Obviously, in that case, his family, the relationship with the physio team completely broke down. There's another case of a psychiatrist told us about prevent referral he himself had made, and in retrospect regretted, because again, a Muslim man having paranoid delusions, diagnosed with schizophrenia, about being surveilled by the police, and also a number of other things, including thoughts of violence and stuff, which are not uncommon with some severe mental health conditions. And then, the next thing he knew, he opened a photo print and the police were sitting in front of him, and the psychiatrist said, you know what, of course it damages the therapeutic relationship. The only thing in those conditions that can help, is like medication therapy and a trusting relationship with the health professional. So those kind of things are having a really deleterious effect on access to healthcare, we think. I'll leave it for
So the Royal College of Psychiatrists has issued a position statement about the problematic lack of evidence base for much of the sort of methodology for determining risk of radicalisation or counter-terror risk from psychological factors. Have you had any role in sort of dealing with that extent of that sort of disinformation, or ensuring that the attitudes of the professionals is better informed?
Yeah, we've engaged with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and we've done research with healthcare professionals themselves. And what we found, I think this is mentioned and underlined in Jacob's report, RSI's report, is widespread confusion among health workers.
Sure.
Because of training which overwhelmingly emphasises the sort of a so-called duty to disclose, which actually legally doesn't exist for individuals. And then occasionally, as an afterthought, we'll mention, you should maybe possibly ask them for consent, always with disclaimers. And we analysed some training materials, got about 120 slides, so I think it was an hour or two prevent training that health workers might be given, and there was something like 12 or 15 instances where it said, don't be the one who didn't speak up, and all these kinds of things. And then maybe three, a small number of mentions of consent, but every time then there was a disclaimer or qualification saying, unless you think it's inappropriate or could damage it. So, we interviewed the former president of the Royal College of GPs, and he told us he didn't think it was right to refer because he understood it as an issue of public safety, right? And so I think one of the things in healthcare is there's a conflation between disclosures for public interest and disclosures for safeguarding. And actually, MedAct's report concluded that there's never a public interest justification for disclosing data, because the accepted thing in the healthcare is it's highly stringent, so it has to be an immediate risk of harm or death, of serious injury or death, to disclose. And of course, that's not what PREVENT is. It's about we suspect you could be on the road to radicalisation. And so we think that's a big reason that PREVENT has been sort of marketed as safeguarding, because it opens up avenues for people to be referred who clearly don't pose an immediate risk. But of course, good safeguarding is consensual safeguarding. And so people are just really confused because they are told, oh no, we're helping people, it's safeguarding, but how can I share this information? Oh, it's because they're a risk. And the other conflation you get in healthcare is between people with capacity to make decisions for themselves, under like the Mental Capacity Act, or without that capacity, and then people who are vulnerable. And there's vulnerability is an accepted thing under the Care Act, I think. But obviously in PREVENT they use this language of vulnerability as well, which is a lot vaguer and a lot lower threshold. And again, so that's a kind of thing, a factor we think playing into the fact that people do not get asked for their consent when referrals happen.
So I was going to come on to ask Miqdaad to talk about the chilling effect in other sectors, but what you've just said has provoked another question in my mind, and that is that when you're looking at these issues, do you ever find, and this is to all of you really, do you ever find any support for the public perception that the purpose of PREVENT is gathering information rather than safeguarding, that it's an intelligence program essentially, that's its raison d'etre? I mean, I'm not saying that it is, I'm saying that that's a public perception which is often advanced when PREVENT is referred to as a toxic brand, and I'm wondering that in your excavations, any of you have found any support for that view?
What I can say is that there are examples which are really problematic. So, for example, there's a mosque which took some PREVENT funding to do a normal event, but they couldn't get funding from anywhere else. PREVENT had funding available. They took that PREVENT-related funding. Why not? Because it lets us do what we want to do. That mosque basically then ended up having to disclose all the attendees of that event to the relevant authorities where the funding was coming from. Why were those people coming to that event? Because this is a trying to de-radicalize people, and guess what? These people have come, so they must have some link to some problematic. They're then put on that list. These are problematic things that happen that have clearly dangerous ramifications and have problems because it starts impacting other mosques or places of worship have nothing to do with this type of activity, and it's much more pervasive. It's not necessarily written in law or in any of the approaches that are taken, but this is what happens as a consequence of this, and I think that's where it becomes really, really difficult.
Yes, and so what if the mosque had said, we're not handing you over those names?
I don't know.
Our money back, please.
So, exactly, and I think that there are huge issues when mosques are put into certain positions where if they don't act in a certain way, they are then red listed. They're a problem, and the whole concept of freedom of religion in its purest sense should not allow this to happen. And you look at lots of other examples, right? I know of one case of a woman who went to I think it was Egypt, or went abroad, came back and started wearing a headscarf. She was 17 or something, like part of the development of someone. She started wearing a headscarf. Suddenly, that was a big factor. That was like, oh wow, that person might be a potential threat. Went through the Prevent program. I was referred to Prevent. Similarly, actually, Nikki Morgan, who was the former education secretary at the time, she was asked a question. I think it was on Channel 4 News, if I recall correctly. She was asked if someone converts their faith. That was seen, because this is a publication by the Department of Education, I think at the time. That was seen as a potential sign of radicalization. So she was asked, well, so if someone Christian becomes another faith, does that also work? And she wasn't able to answer.
Yeah.
This is the reality that is happening. That freedom of your religion is also being impacted in this way. Again, another example, I think in Parliament, Gavin Williamson, if I'm not mistaken, but I can check it later, said something along the lines of, this is not a this is a counter-Islamic strategy. Because in essence, that's what actually is happening. He was someone who was working on this space, because he was someone who was within Northern Ireland, and he saw some of these issues that were happening, and he saw that wasn't the prevent duty is not applicable in Northern Ireland in schools, for example. And he was wondering, why is that the case? And this is the reality. If the theory is that this is supposed to prevent people from going down this radicalization route, given that our national security status says that domestic terrorism in Northern Ireland is a serious concern, why is there not the same process, same duty in place in Northern Ireland where there's similar? The reason is quite simple. Because if you had some of these duties in place in a Catholic or Protestant area and where the tensions are already high, and one of these referrals happened, it would be disastrous.
Yes.
It would cause huge issues. But in Muslim communities as a whole, there isn't that pushback as much as it possibly could be, and it seems like it's passed much more easily.
Yes, playing devil's advocate.
Yes.
Much of those who sort of support Prevent and implement Prevent would say that many of the Prevent referrals and many of the sort of steps towards heading off from extremism, if we can call it that, I still don't know what extremism means, but I'm just using it as a useful bit of shorthand. Were in fact right-wing or neo-Nazi or other forms of sort of white, if we can call it that, terrorism. I mean, is that an idea you get behind, or is it something that you think is okay, or anything in between?
I'm sure others will have good things to say on this, but I mean, for me, firstly, it's still massively disproportionately Muslim. Firstly, that's worth noting. There's a fundamental challenge here when it comes to what is defined as extremism when you're starting to think about these things, right? If you think about what the definition of extremism is within the Prevent strategy, it says someone who is vocal, active opposition to British values, and that's freedom of religion, free speech and two other things which I can't remember off the top of my head, which I should remember. So when you look at some of these ideas and say, so who would be considered an extremist? I mean, it would be very difficult to say, half of the authoritarian dictators which our government is engaging with are not extremists very, very clearly, but engaging with them is fine, right?
Yeah.
Where is this idea of where extremism is considered to be really extremism? And I don't think that the people who are deciding this are deciding this in any consistent manner. I also don't think that when it comes to looking at right-wing extremism, there is really a proper understanding. If you look at the early days of Prevent in particular, there's a lot of evidence of the way it was. You had areas which had large number of Muslim communities in Manchester, I believe. Project Liberty brought this up, and they found out that the cameras, there were a large number of cameras in Muslim-specific areas. If you actually look at the funding of Prevent, Dr. Maria Norris did an analysis, and she showed that areas which had more than 5% Muslims had much more funding, for example, than those which had less. And even if there was no understanding or risk of radicalization perceived by the police in that area, they suddenly had significantly greater, and then there was basically a correlation between the number of Muslims in there and the funding that was coming to them, according to Dr. Maria Norris's analysis. So when you look at all of these things together, it is very difficult to come to the conclusion that this is not targeting Muslims in particular. And if you stand back and you try and say, look at the last 50 years, 20 years, even the last 20 years, if you look at the number of people who have been terrorist attacks that have happened, actually Northern Ireland plays a large portion of that. But again, not part of the analysis at all. So I don't buy this argument. I don't think there's much evidence for credence to that argument. And given the cases and examples I've seen and the chilling effect that happens, I don't think that's true. And the final point is on universities. When you look at universities right now, the number of Islamic societies where they just aren't able to hold events in the same way as they used to before. Why? Because there's an expectation that you have to abide by a whole series of things which cause many issues for Islamic societies. And they're not able to therefore have an event about Palestine so easily. They have to have someone who is pro-apartheid and against apartheid in a discussion on an issue. And that seems ridiculous when you want to fight against what you consider to be human rights abuses. And so when you look at all of these things in the whole, it seems like Muslims and Muslim societies at university are the ones who are complaining very, very, very heavily about what's going on.
Yes. Does anybody else want to comment on that question? Yes, weigh in.
So I definitely think the far right referrals is a red herring because firstly, when you look at the proportion of Muslims in the UK, we still only make up 5% of the UK population. And so to look at raw numbers and suggest, we had 1,000 far-right referrals and only 800 referrals for Islamistic extremism, it doesn't actually show, it doesn't represent anything. You're showing raw numbers and you're deliberately fudging those numbers to show what you want to see, basically. It's really interesting if you think about how Prevent was introduced. It was introduced for the Muslim community, no doubt about that, admission on all the government documents, even at one point calling it the Preventing Muslim Extremism Strategy across their documents. But the way Muslims had buy-in, they were trying to make a Prevent for the Muslim community, by the Muslim community. It's your problem, you take responsibility for it, we'll give you money, we'll get your buy-in. And actually, if you think about the far right, this idea of bringing in the far right to Prevent, it is a brilliant way to, again, get Muslim buy-in, because Muslims will be thinking, Prevent's not too bad because it's protecting us from these people who are going to come and beat us up, without realising that actually, hate crimes are hate crimes. They're already dealt with in legislation. You don't need Prevent to stop a hate crime from happening. And this conflation between different terms and different pieces of legislation is part of why I think extremism will never be legally defined and it will never have a agreed, even non-legal definition, because it suits the government very well to have a nice, fluid definition of extremism. If you look today at the Prevent priority areas, these are areas, boroughs, that are receiving injections of Prevent funding. We put in FOI as part of People's Review of Prevent. Firstly, it took us ages because all the boroughs just told us they don't hold that information. I don't know how you don't hold information of money that you are receiving for Prevent, but we finally managed to get it from the Home Office in what we believe was a mistake. But it showed that 75% of the Muslim community in the UK live within a Prevent priority area. So even though they didn't want to explain to us how they got, what the criteria was for defining these areas that needed extra funding, we could just see from the census information that 75% of Muslims are living there compared to, a third of the general population.
Can I add something as well? I think Miqdaad and Layla said it very well, but I would just echo the fact that, what you mentioned at the start of your question about how extremism is very hard to define is really the explanation for why it will never be even-handed, because it is a racialized concept. When you go down to the evidence, the extremism risk guidance, 22 plus factors, when they try to operationalize what that means, to tell health workers or teachers or university lecturers or whoever how to spot these potential extremists, you see the racial bias coming out. So in the MedAct report, we analysed some training. Was the training size? No, it was a website called Let's Talk About It. Let's Talk About Terrorism. And then the way they operationalised the values, there were all kinds of coded dog whistles in there. So, for example, things that could make you vulnerable to to radicalisation could be experiences of racism. Now, that doesn't affect white people, maybe Irish people to be fair, but and there was other instances like distrust of the Western media. So they're not explicitly saying watch out for the black and brown people, but it's pretty obvious who the finger is being pointed at here. And so it's never going to be even-handed as a far right. And actually, I would go so far as to say Prevent is feeding the far right by rolling out into civil society this idea that we should be surveilling each other.
Sorry, I just round out the panel. Just three thoughts from me. One, I think it's useful to bear in mind the context of the current independent review of Prevent. There were leaks from a current reviewer stating that Prevent was focusing now too much on right-wing extremism and was, as a result, limiting free speech. And I think that's useful to bear in mind. The other 2 points are to do with data and in the government's most recent data, we can see that they argue that there's been quite an increase in the proportion of right-wing extremism that's been referred through Prevent. However, that's also accompanied kind of a recategorization, and there is an argument there that kind of the way that the categories have moved about kind of impacts that analysis. And secondly, on the data, if you crunch the numbers, you'll find that kind of so-called Islamist referrals are less likely to go through and have a channel support that.
I was going to mention that. I know that through some other witness evidence that I know. Yeah, so that's right. And that says a lot about risk-based analyses which are applied. So bearing all that in mind, what role, and I'd like each of the panel to have a response to this, what role do you say that consent has in data sharing? So for instance, I'd like you to think about consent on the part of individuals having their data shared, but also public consent to that approach.
I think from a casework perspective, what we've seen is that there is never consent. Even if the person is told before the Prevent referral kicks in, they are told that Prevent referral is going to be made. So they never really have any consent. With regards to actually then engaging with Prevent moving forward after the referral, again, consent is, if they do give consent to engage, is basically they come under huge amounts of pressure and various tactics. So for example, you'll have social workers saying, well, you need to engage with Prevent. These are social workers who should actually be independent from Prevent, saying, in order for me to carry out my assessment and for you to tick all the boxes, my recommendation is that you engage with Prevent. Now, obviously, they've come away and realised that the family doesn't have any issues, but they then receive that pressure from counter-terrorism officers, as opposed to the young social worker being led by this counter-terrorism officer. So there's never really any consent, and a lot of people aren't even it's not explaining to them what is happening. We've had people call us and say, this happened, and then I had a mentor, this also ties in with an example of far right, which just shows how ridiculous the far right referrals are as well. So we had a young child who was referred to Prevent. It was a far right referral. He's a keen history reader, accused his teachers when he was challenging, as young boys do, challenging the teacher was telling him to do this, do that. He said, oh, this is like a Stasi state. They referred this child to Prevent, and then, basically the mum had no idea what this child was going through. They said, oh, we're going to give him a mentor to deal with his issues. During that time, by the way, he converted to Islam, and she just saw it as a phase. But his mentor came in, and his mentor was a Muslim man mentor, who the mother said was basically teaching my child how to be a good Muslim. She was obviously livid, as a non-Muslim herself, thinking, well, my child's just going through a phase. Why are you coming and reinforcing and kind of helping him to become Muslim? I'm just hoping that he's going to read this and move along. So she stopped. Now, as she was describing this to me, she had no idea that that was actually part of the channel process. So there's never really a sense of consent from what we see on the ground, and the far right referrals are just another way of trying to campaign for an equal opportunities for oppression, rather than any genuine we have far right cases that we're going to put through.
Brilliant. But one slight addition to note, an example which I think is worth noting is how institutions play this role when it comes to consent. So when it comes to many schools, there are examples of schools who have been downgraded, and part of the reason why they were downgraded, written in the actual documents, was that they didn't have any Prevent referrals. And you're thinking, well, maybe there wasn't a problem. I mean, maybe that really, it's only the only 4-year-olds, there may not be a problem. But no, that school was downgraded because they hadn't had Prevent referrals and they just expected them to. And so the pressure that puts on teachers, nursery teachers, and people involved to actually refer to Prevent, because if they don't, the whole school will get down. It's entire. This is not the fault of those teachers in the slightest. Even if they're doing, they're in a very difficult circumstance. And so, the way that institutions play that role, I think, is really important. And when you look at Ofsted, I mean, in its own guidance when it comes to looking at radicalization, one of the examples it had was included the line of a young child having a Quran in his room as a sign, as part of an example of someone who was radicalized. And you think, why is that mentioned as part of that radicalization example by Ofsted, as the people who say this is the perfect way of dealing with it?
You're hitting on a theme which I think runs through everything that everyone's saying, which is who owns risk. Who owns risk analysis? You touched on the sort of mosaic approach to different threads that get drawn together, but it's interesting to note that although community buy-in and professional buy-in is sought, those professionals aren't allowed to exercise their own discretion on what is and what isn't a risk and what's been handled appropriately by them, because they know the child or because they're in the environment where they have a better understanding than your standard CT officer coming in.
I think one of the biggest problem or challenges that the response will be is that what happens if something bad happens and that person was not referred and you were the person who could have referred them and you didn't? And the problem is that that pressure is put in the wrong place. When it comes to teachers, this is not that's not their responsibility. And unfortunately, the way that this is being created is it's completely converted some of these ideas of trust that you have with your teacher in certain circumstances, in certain cases, because of some of these referrals. And I think that's where some of the problem lies.
So what you're saying then is that that problem has effectively closed down benign ways of dealing with what might be a normal teenage inquiry or
There are lots of cases.
Yeah.
Layla will be able to give probably more cases.
We've had one example where the teacher actually put in writing, she said, when the mother challenged, she said, why did you refer my 4-year-old? This was the fortnight case. Why did you refer my 4-year-old? I came and picked him up at 5 o'clock. You could have spoken to me about it. The teacher actually put in black and white, it was not for me to investigate. I did my duty and I sent it to Prevent. She completely shut down any professional judgment she could have made, even just to kind of follow on with a question. Like no one's gonna tell you off for following up with a question and realising it's an online game. Maybe speak to the parents. So all of these teachable moments are thrown out the window. I think Dr. Charlotte Heath-Kelly represented it brilliantly in one of the early works. I think it was counter-extremism or counter-terrorism within the NHS. That report where she showed that everything is going through prevent, and actually, where does it end up when it goes through prevent? It ends up back in social care, mental health care. These services already exist. Now, money was withdrawn for these services in 2015. At the same time, money was being pumped in to prevent, to put it on a statutory footing. So you have to think about it in terms of like, why are these services not being engaged by the professionals who used to actually refer them previously? And I'm quite worried because I think that, at the moment we still have a lot of professionals who understand what safeguarding looked like prior to prevent. But as you go through this like evolution of prevent, it's been 15 years plus since we've had prevent around, right? As you go through this evolution, you are getting new people, new generations who don't understand safeguarding without prevent. Like, what is safeguarding without prevent? They don't know what that looks like. And so you're going to get less and less of this professional judgment and this acknowledgement of what you mentioned previously.
That's like a muscle, isn't it? If you don't use it, you lose it. It's de-skilling, isn't it, in a sense? Dr. Aked, did you want to come in on the role of consent?
Yeah, I think Miqdaad put it very well. I would echo what Miqdaad was saying about the fact that Home Office uses numbers of prevent referrals and levels of prevent training as a kind of sign of institutional compliance means that this pressure is cascading down on NHS trusts, onto the workers. And I talked about already how the training slides, just basically emphasise, as Layla was saying, like, don't think for yourself, just refer. Like, don't worry, just refer. Just if you're concerned at all, just refer. And I think when we interviewed health workers, what they said to us was like, how could it ever be informed consent? Because I have no idea what the pathway is. Informed consent requires an understanding of the risks, the benefits, potential to the patient, and they're not having those conversations. There were instances in our case studies of people who'd been asked to prevent, but I would question whether it was really informed consent, people who were severely ill, trusted health professionals to sort of act in their best interests. And yeah, I think what you pointed out about teachers as well, being put in difficult positions also applies to health workers. They do deal with like people who are hearing voices telling them to do things in like complex situations, and yeah, as Layla said, it's eroding the professional training that, like, for example, psychiatrists already get in how to handle risk in those situations. And Tarek Yunus wrote a really good paper where he talks about the moral distress that health workers experience being put in that position. One GP told us that she didn't want to see her name in the headlines the next day if something did happen. So they're fearful for their jobs. They're already under huge, the healthcare system, mental health, GP surgeries are in crisis already. So this is adding another kind of burden on them. And I think that MedAct is working to kind of support them to withdraw consent collectively. We do. My colleague does like alternative trainings on prevent. So if you do know any health workers who are interested in like getting support with that, please send them our way.
So have any of you come across good practice in information sharing in this context?
I can kind of say some parts based on the report. I think just going quickly back to the consent question, I think my perception is that, at least from kind of a legal perspective, the public thinks the law gives greater precedence to consent, and so we see that there are a whole range of other grounds that practitioners or local authorities can rely on when trying to justify processing someone's personal data. I teach a course on privacy and data governance in my other role, and I was speaking with my students about it the other day, and before kind of teaching them about data protection law, I asked, what do you think the most important thing is? And everyone answered consent. Well, we see here that, as you'll see in the report, there are kind of numerous possible grounds that the authorities might try and argue. I think, there are some interesting examples. I talk a bit about kind of the different approaches taken by the NHS, the General Medical Council, and the British Medical Association. And we see that actually the NHS England changed its policy in light of some concerns that were raised by practitioners, that they were being asked to share data too frequently. And we see that as a result of that, if you compare the two policies, the more recent one includes kind of greater reference to consent, kind of removes a lot of the reference to kind of monitoring and enforcement and things like that. So I guess if we've seen in that context, at least, if the practitioners push back, sometimes you might be able to get a change in the policy, but that doesn't change it from the government level or the statutory level either.
So that's not wholly bleak. So you've got some sort of pushback from professionals. That really reflects the pushback that the BMA and the other medical organisations gave to the diktats from the Home Office to data collect for immigration purposes, and they had a similar similar response.
I guess the kind of limits of that, though, is that it's limited to kind of professional guidance, and while has a varying level of influence depending on what practitioners we're talking about, it doesn't impact the fact that government-specific policy or policy by government departments doesn't go anywhere near the same level of reference to consent. I think as Dr. Aked was mentioning earlier, one thing that I found from looking through all of these policies, one of the things that jumped out to me was there might be one reference to consent, but then that's followed by a page on monitoring and enforcement powers and what could happen if you don't refer someone. And so I think while you might have individual examples of some organisations or authorities' policies that are kind of a bit more reference to human rights and privacy, that's going to have limited impact if the government policy stays the same.
Understood. That's helpful. So, were there any other effects that anybody wanted to talk about of the various reporting obligations imposed by the Prevent statutory scheme?
Why not? I think universities are a really interesting space to just explore a bit further. As a university, they're supposed to be a bastion of free speech, a place where people are allowed and supposed to argue and have their discussions. The ramifications of Prevent on universities and what that means for their ability to engage and speak about controversial topics in a way that's outspoken, the challenges norms, challenges everything, is very, very much more limited. And I think that has, and what's really worth knowing here is the hypocrisy, right? On the one hand, you see government ministers out in the media and publicly speaking about how important it is that people don't get cancelled, and with the idea that they should not be they should be allowed to be racist. They should be allowed to be bigoted in many different ways. But at the same time, whilst encouraging that free speech in that space, where it's not actually even free speech anyway, it's inviting people to come in. On the other hand, they're actually actively preventing free speech on issues of concern, on green issues, on Palestine.
You seem to be talking about mission creep of Prevent into a species of culture war.
Yes, I think it highlights the hypocrisy of